Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ann Kinseth, and I'm the Director of Education at the Meadows Museum. And I'm happy to welcome you to our Further Afield virtual talk today with Dr. Daniel Herschensen, titled Captive Objects, Catholic Artifacts Across the Early Modern Mediterranean. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. First of all, I'm going to kindly request that everyone keep their microphone on mute throughout the presentation. Second, I do want to make everyone aware that we are recording today's presentation with the hopes that we'll be able to add it to the Meadows Museum YouTube channel in the future. And finally, I would like to invite everyone to use the chat box today to share questions that you may have for our speaker. We will address those at the end, and we'll get to as many as time will allow for. So it is my pleasure to introduce Daniel Herschensen. He's an associate professor in the Department of Literatures, Culture, and Languages at the University of Connecticut, researching the early modern Mediterranean history of Spain. His book, The Captive Sea, Slavery, Communication, and Commerce in Early Modern Spain and the Mediterranean, has won a number of awards, including honorable mention in the Mediterranean Seminar First Book Prize in 2021, the 2019 Best First Book Prize for books published in the field of Iberian history by the Association for Spanish and Portuguese Historical Studies, and the Sharon Harris Book Award by the University of Connecticut Humanities Institute. He's published a number of articles, including in Past and Present and the Journal of Early Modern History. And in 2019-2020, he was the Sir John Eliot Fellow at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies, where he was working on his current book project, Captive Objects, Religious Artifacts, Piracy, and Slavery in the Early Modern Mediterranean. And finally, last year, he continued to pursue this project as an ACLS Frederick Burkhardt Fellow at the Heyman Center for Humanities in Columbia University. And it is my pleasure to now turn the presentation over to him now. So welcome, Daniel Herschensen.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here. Can you hear me? Just making sure. Hello?
Yes.
You can hear me?
Great. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So thank you everybody for making the time and for attending this talk. This is part of a new book project that look at religious material objects, Muslim, Islamic, and Christian in the early modern Mediterranean. And today I'm going to focus on Catholic artifacts. So let me start without further ado. On April 25th, 1681, the Moroccan army of Alawi Sultan Maulay Ismail occupied the Spanish city of La Marmora, which you can see here. This is the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Here is the Mediterranean, and up, we cannot see it, but Spain is right up here. And the city is located in the Atlantic coast of Morocco. He took over the city, and he took 250 soldiers and 45 women and children captive. But they also looted the local church, seizing 17 religious images, among them a life-size statue of Christ, known as the Christ of Medina Celi, currently the most venerated religious object in Madrid. Soon after, the Spanish King Carlos II, soon after he heard the news, he ordered Trinitarian friars who ministered to Christian captives overseas to embark on a redemption mission and ensure the release of all captured humans and objects, most of which were soon back in Spain. 8 years later, in November 1689, the Sultan took the much larger city of Larache here, and after a long siege, 1,722 Spaniards and a number of religious objects were taken captive. Owing to the large number, it took the Franciscan friars in charge of the operation almost a decade to redeem them all. Many of the devotional and liturgical objects were returned to Spain in the first month of 1692. Catholic artifacts, pictures and sculptures of the Virgin Mary and the saints, missals, rosaries, crucifixes, you name it, they all circulated in their thousands throughout the early modern Western Mediterranean, crisscrossing the boundaries between Muslim and Christian communities. This mobility was largely an indirect byproduct of privateering or state-sanctioned piracy and the trafficking of 2 to 3 million persons from all sides between 1500 and 1800, an activity which intertwined Spain's Mediterranean territory, Morocco, and Ottoman Algiers. Maritime war not only led to the migration of sacred artifacts, but also created the conditions under which some of these objects were taken captives, desecrated, and redeemed, somewhat paralleling the experience of human captives. I will follow the travels of these travels and travails, we might say, of these artifacts between the Spanish-Ottoman truce of 1581 and the first Algerian conquest of Spanish Oran, another colony in North Africa, in 1708. What I will suggest is that Catholic artifacts played a significant and unexpected roles in the captivity of Catholics in the Islamic Maghreb or North Africa, as well as in the economy of ransom that facilitated the rescue of captives of both confessions. More specifically, I will show that such artifacts, against the design of their initial distributor, provided unanticipated affordances or opportunities for action to Catholic captives, their Muslim masters, and to converts to Islam, thereby creating new entanglements between members of these groups and Catholic material objects. And what I will suggest to you today, what I will present you today with, is an argument that I will develop in 3 steps. First, I will claim that the surge in captivity of Christians and also Muslims following the 1581 Ottoman-Spanish truce led to an increase in the number of Catholic artifacts that circulated across the Muslim-Christian Mediterranean frontier. And most of these objects began their journey, so to speak, when they were sent from Spain to the Maghreb to help Catholic captives cling to their faith, maintain the ill-defined religious boundary, and minimize religious mixing. Second, I will argue that many of these objects failed to accomplish their stated mission and contributed to the blurring of the boundary they were explicitly sent to uphold. And this happened for several reasons. To begin with, when Christians who had converted to Islam used rosaries and crucifixes to claim a Catholic identity while outwardly living as Muslims. It also happened because these artifacts were often plundered by Algerians and Moroccans, just as Christians plundered Islamic manuscripts. And that meant that the artifacts themselves needed assistance in the form of ransom. Third, and lastly, the plunder and repurposing of these objects were productive instances, we might think about them in these terms, for all the parties involved. Plundered objects allowed captives the power to redeem an emblem of their god, and in so doing provided them with agency we rarely associate with slaves. Trinitarian and Mercedarian friars seized opportunities to ransom these objects and win fame back home. In addition, Muslim rulers broke or threatened to break objects as means of securing religious privileges for their subjects enslaved in Spain. And in this way, the objects permitted or afforded these rulers an opportunity to care for their subjects and to claim spiritual guardianship and political sovereignty over them. Let me first situate us historically, politically, and geographically. This context will explain the circumstances in which communities of free and bonded Christians were formed in the Maghreb. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople or Istanbul in 1453 and the Spanish conquest of Granada in 1492 ushered in a new imperial rivalry in the Mediterranean. And you can see that the Ottomans here in yellow control more than half of the Mediterranean, most of the Eastern Mediterranean, but also part of the Central Mediterranean. During much of the 16th century, the Spanish Catholic monarchy, when I say the Catholic monarchy, obviously it's the Spanish Catholic monarchy, intensively engaged in belligerent Mediterranean politics, devised attack plans and conquered, but also lost a number of cities in the Maghreb. And here you can see the Spanish territories in the Mediterranean, with a string of garrisons in North Africa, with the Balearics, with Sardinia, with Naples, with Sicily. So most of the Western Mediterranean is controlled by Spain. In 1581, however, the two empires signed a truce, allowing the Ottomans to turn their military attention east towards Safavid Persia and the Spaniards west towards the Atlantic world. And when the imperial frontier was transformed from an offensive to a defensive one, corsairs or privateers stepped into to fill in the vacuum left by imperial fleets, and as a result, the number of captives taken on both sides increased. And here you can see some of the routes of Mediterranean privateers from North Africa and from the European coasts of the Mediterranean. Christian and Muslim merchants, missionaries, converts, and ransomers continued to cross religious and imperial boundaries, but captives and slaves formed the bulk of this human circulation. People purchased captives for a variety of reasons, but the profit derived from ransom, from freeing them, was a powerful engine of the Mediterranean system of bondage. As a result of piracy and slave raids, Muslim cities came to have bustling populations of free and bonded Christians who enjoyed limited access to Christian forms of worship, permitted mostly in the prisons in which the captives were held. So the archives show us that most of the important cities in North Africa had chapels and churches and hospitals, Christian hospitals, mostly in the prisons of the captives. Christian captives were allowed to practice their faith because Muslims didn't want them to convert to Islam. Why didn't they want them to convert to Islam? Because conversion removed captives from networks of exchange and eliminated them as a source of potential profit. Think about it. If a Christian captive convert to Islam in North Africa, his community in Spain, let's say, is not interested in saving him anymore. Plus, the community to which he joined by his conversion is not interested in giving up on him now because he's a community member. So this is why Muslims objected conversion of Christians. Moreover, Muslim rulers expected Christian rulers to provide enslaved Muslims with similar religious privileges, meaning they expected that their Muslim subject enslaved in Spain will not be, for example, baptized by force. Allowing Christians to practice the religion was thus a way to secure comparable conditions for Muslim slave communities in Christendom. Human trafficking then led to the formation of communities of slaves in Islamic North Africa. And this reality and the fear of religious cross-pollination it threatened to generate formed the context for massive shipments of religious artifacts from the Spanish Mediterranean to North Africa. Spanish and Roman friars, high ecclesiastics, and nobles sent liturgical and devotional objects from Spain and from Rome to communities of Catholic captives in Muslim cities. The aim was to help them endure the trials of captivity and to allow them to cling to their religion despite the ambient temptation to convert to Islam. Two examples: the Trinitarian Bernardo de Monroy, a Spaniard held captive in Algiers in the 1610s, ordered and received from Spain chalices, patens, altars, missals, cases full of rosaries, medals, and prints of the Virgin Mary, booklets of saint lives, and Bibles. All of this was shipped to Algiers in North Africa. In a letter from 1680, the apostolic vicar in Algiers wrote to the papacy, thanking it for medals and crosses that the papacy sent from Rome, medals and crosses which the vicar had dispensed to the captives, hoping they would help preserve their faith. While small and cheap objects served individuals, monumental objects ended up adorning the walls of local churches. Listen to this 18th century description of the Catholic hospital in Tunis. Of the three altars, the main one had an image of infant Christ wearing a crown of gilded silver, while another had a crucifix carved from stone. There was a statue of the Virgin of the Remedies and another of the Virgin of the Purification, the latter clad in a rich tapestry dress from Spain, portraits of Saint John of Matha, the Virgin of the Trinity, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and Saint Felix of Valois, and marble effigies of Saint Sebastian and Saint Rosalia and Saint Relics. You hear this description and it sounds as if the author, the speaker, is describing a church in Italy or in Spain, right? But this is Ottoman Algiers, actually. Ottoman Tunis. Let us now turn to examine interactions on an intimate scale between Catholic captives and renegades. Renegades is the Christian term for Christian captives who converted to Islam during in the context of their captivity. Captives were the main beneficiaries of exported devotional objects, but rosaries, scapulars, crucifixes, and other objects also circulated among renegades. By possessing devotional objects and presenting them to Catholic captives, to priest captives, to friar-held captives, renegades who didn't wish to wholly sever their relations with Christians could claim continuous membership in the religious community they allegedly left when they had converted. Converts knew that should they be captured on the high seas by Spanish forces, they would have to face the Inquisition and account for their conversion. And they might end up being sentenced to years as galley slaves. Even renegades who simply dreamt of returning to their flock and own communities knew that they would have to account for their conversion and convince the inquisitors of their Christianity. By demonstrating devotion to religious artifacts in front of captives, in front of captive ecclesiastics, renegades were positioning these members of these groups as future character witnesses in an inquisitorial trial. In this sense, devotion to these objects promised to provide renegades with legally mitigating circumstances and hard evidence that, quote, they had converted by word but not by heart, end of quote. This, of course, doesn't mean that converts who secretly owned these objects own them only or always strategically or instrumentally. No, they might have believed that these objects had the power to intercede on their owner's behalf, both in their daily interactions with Christians in North Africa, but also in the future back in their homeland. Thus, in focusing on renegades' use of Catholic material culture, I set aside issues of faith or sincerity of belief to analyze instead the social effects of owning, of making, of presenting, of mentioning Catholic devotional objects to others. We've seen that, we already know that Muslim masters were reluctant to permit their Christian slaves to convert to Christianity, and yet, despite this resistance, conversion to Christianity, to Islam, was common among Christian captives. Renegades justified their conversion in a number of ways. They explained that they desired to improve their living condition. They feared that their family had given up on them. They wanted to avoid physical punishment, or they simply have been convinced by the message of Islam. Formally, all that conversion required was the recitation of the Muslim profession of faith and the wearing of a turban. But beyond these emblems of conversion was a prolonged process whose social, political, and legal implications were more significant than its religious ones. Indeed, because of the gap between formal requirements of conversion and its lasting effects, renegades could claim to their former co-religionists that they remained loyal members of the Catholic community even after their conversion. Simultaneously, they might be treated with suspicion by Muslims who controlled their freedom of movement and kept a close eye on their interactions with Christians. By reconstructing renegades' claims of belonging, we can establish the polyvalent roles and distorting effects of Christian material culture on the boundary between the religions. Now, on the basis of inquisitorial documents, we know that the most popular devotional objects owned by renegades were scapulars of Our Lady of Mount Carmel and rosaries. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on rosaries. Their ubiquity seems to reflect this object's appeal across the social classes in early modern Europe. A key moment in the rise of the rosary's popularity was the Christian victory over the Ottoman fleet in Lepanto in 1578. The following year, to commemorate the victory, Pope Pius V promised indulgences to members of confraternities of the Rosary, and in 1573, his successor, Gregory VIII, establish a feast of the Virgin of the Rosary as a homage to the Christian triumph. In fact, the Virgin of the Rosary had a chapel in one of the churches of the captives in Algiers, and one of the fraternities of the captives in Marrakesh, the Moroccan capital, was dedicated to her. An emblem of the victory over Islam, the Rosary and images associated with it provided specific support not only for captives, but also for renegades who either wished to return home or didn't want to sever relations with their former confessional community. A closer look reveals particularities in renegades' use of the Rosary. Renegades who openly owned devotional objects or communicated with captive priests who dispensed them assumed grave risks which could incriminate them and confirm their guilt in stubbornly clinging to their former religion. Muslim owners of renegades who had not yet been manumitted warned them not to own crosses, rosaries, or other devotional objects. Renegades therefore had to keep their images well hidden or privilege those objects that didn't resemble what they were supposed to. In this context, the allusions to prayer beads by Miguel de Cervantes, the author of El Quixote, who spent 5 years as a captive in Algiers, are illuminating. In a play he wrote, titled The Bagnos of Algiers, or the Prisons of Algiers, Francisco, a child recently forced to convert to Islam, recounts how his captors had returned his prayer beads after taking away the crucifix attached to them. Cervantes implies that by cleansing the beads of the crucifix, Francisco's captors converted his rosary into a misbaha, an Islamic prayer beads. In a later scene, Halima, the wife of a fierce pirate, notices that Zara, a Muslim secretly raised as a Christian by her captive wet nurse, had a crucifix on her prayer beads, presumably a misbaha, to which she has affixed the image. And just so to get a sense of how they look. These are misbahas. Presumably a misbaha to which she had affixed the image. By suggesting that the essential difference between the rosary and the misbaha is simply the crucifix attached to the former, Cervantes offers an explanation for the popularity of rosaries among renegades. While it was impossible to justify to other Muslims the possession of crucifixes, scapulars, or images of the saints, the likelihood of having to explain possession of a rosary detached of its crucifix was negligible, as it could pass as a misbaha. Wait, but were rosaries really so similar to misbahas? Most misbahas had 99 beads, 40 more than the average rosary, but some had only 33 beads, and rosaries with more than 59 beads were not uncommon. Both strings of beads served to count prayers or the names of Allah recited silently or aloud, and were associated with specific gestures of the fingers. Yet the testimonies of the two renegades during their inquisitorial trial challenges the idea that Islamic beads could pass for Christian ones and vice versa by highlighting the importance of concealing the rosaries from their masters. So we're talking about two renegades that were captured by Spanish forces, were sentenced in the Inquisition, and this is material that I extracted from their court case. Both of them claimed that to prevent their masters knowing they possessed rosaries, they crafted their own. Juan Perez, who had converted to Islam after being sold as a slave in Algiers in 1635, commended himself to God and to the Virgin of the Rosary, of which he recalled making a version by tying knots in a rope, quote, so that the Moors would not identify it, end of quote. Similarly, Salvador Martinez Menarguez, who in 1656 converted to Islam in Algiers, reported carefully crafting, quote, a rosary of a palm tree threads with a cross made of the very same thread, end of quote. In terms of their resemblance to those fabricated in the Catholic world, the objects renegades crafted had to be somewhat abstract so that Muslim masters could not readily identify them as overtly Christian symbols and punish their owners or creator. But they couldn't be too abstract, as other Christians needed to be able to identify them as Christian artifacts. Handmade rosaries satisfy these contrasting requirements of identifiability and subterfuge, but were nevertheless identifiable enough that carrying them entailed a risk. Performance was key in making beads with the right meaning, in marking beads with the right meaning. Misbaha when interacting with Muslims, and a rosary when interacting with Christians. In other words, while it is likely that Muslims or Christians confused rosaries for misbahas and vice versa, it is unlikely, renegades could use misbahas to recite Hail Marys. The key to their success in convincing Catholic captives of their continuous belonging to the Christian community lay not so much in the object's form, rosary or misbaha, but rather in the overall performance of attachment, loyalty, and devotion expressed in praying and making the right physical gestures. Prayer beads thus played a key role in the management of relations between renegades and captives. Those objects served renegades as props in the performance of their claims to continued membership in the Christian community. Simultaneously, they offer Catholic captives and later inquisitors an interpretative medium for deciphering the claims made by renegades. In Catholic eyes, the return of renegades to the fold offered a living example of Christianity's superiority over Islam, but a side effect of this victory was the presence of converts who claimed to be Catholic while behaving like Muslims, thereby blaming the boundary between these religions. Catholic materiality didn't create the phenomenon of renegades and the ambiguity their existence implied, but it did play a key role in generating and prolonging this ambiguity in face-to-face interactions that enacted and reenacted links between the local and regional and between the Maghreb and Iberia. Enough about rosaries. The traffic of humans generated conditions for the mostly non-violent circulation of religious artifacts, but also for their plunder and redemption. An unknown number of these items, generally small but also much larger objects such as life-size statues, became victims of the plunder economy, redirecting their original course. For example, Antonio de Sosa, held captive in Algiers in the 1570, and the author of the most famous early modern treatise on that city, mentions an image of John the Baptist taken from a Maltese galley in 1570, another of St. Paul also taken from a Maltese galley in 1577, and a statue of a saintly angel taken from a Sicilian galley. The three items were hung upside down on one of the city's gates to humiliate Christians and eventually broken up and burned. I mentioned that captives, the authorities in North Africa allowed captives to have churches in their prisons. But on occasion, Moroccans, Algerians, and Tunisians broke into the captive churches to seize or damage crosses, chalices, or images, or at least they threatened to do so. They threatened to attack Catholic churches and their images and often executed such threats. These attacks were part of larger reciprocal violence on a Mediterranean scale. Algerians heard that Algerian slaves in Spain were baptized by force, and they rushed to threaten to break religious images. And through breaking or even threatening to do so, these were, or rather threatening and breaking, were means for Algerians of claiming religious privilege for Muslims enslaved in Spain, and thereby claiming Islamic guardianship over the Western Mediterranean. These confiscations and plunder of artifacts must have been how Catholic artifacts fell into the hands of individual North Africans who later sold them to individual captives wishing to redeem such objects. Indeed, captives and ecclesiastics redeemed such objects, especially in the case of small and inexpensive ones. For example, the Basque captive Pedro Munjo de Nobero ransomed a painting of Our Lady of St. Joseph for 6 pieces of 8 in his 8 years of captivity. That was in 1628. He carefully kept the image for 6 more years in the prison cell until he himself was ransomed. Upon returning to his native land, He donated it to the Franciscan sanctuary of Our Lady of Aranzazu in the Basque village of Oñati. Another place where we see this phenomenon of Christian redeeming Christian object is in the Catholic hospital in Algiers, which became a place where non-Catholics occasionally stopped by to sell a devotional object that had fallen into their possession. A few of these objects survived the early modern travails and can be found today in churches, convents, hospitals, and other religious residences. And let me show you some of them. So this is the Holy Child of Meknes, captured in the 1680s, currently at the Franciscan Hospital of Madrid. And this is another little statue that is at the Trinitarian Residency in Madrid, also ransom from Algiers. And another baby Christ, known as the Holy Captive Child, infant, that I don't know if anyone identified this, but this is a chapel in the Metropolitan Cathedral of New Mexico. So after spending time as a captive in Algiers, this statue made its way to New Mexico. The capture of religious images might have marked the failure of their intended mission, but it was also a productive moment in which objects, as a result of their repurposing, permitted new opportunities to those around them. More specifically, Christian images helped captives cling to their faith, even when, or rather because, the images were captured and desecrated. When captives redeemed images of Christ or Mary, or crosses or crucifixes, the traditional division of labor between God and believers was transformed. The slaves were exercising an ability to free an emblem of their God. Instead of Christ redeeming Christians, it was the faithful who redeemed objects and offered a channel to their God, objects that offered a channel to their God. The act of redemption connected believers to their God while publicly affirming the Christian identity of the captives, who were therefore unlikely to break down and convert to Islam. In the Maghreb then, religious artifacts asserted captives' power to negotiate with their masters and to purchase and own property, and thus expanded captives' freedom. Let us turn now to the Moroccan conquest of the two Spanish colonies with which I opened this lecture. As a result, larger and more expensive Catholic items became captive objects. Their exchange involved political actors such as the Spanish king and the Moroccan sultan, as well as Trinitarians and Franciscan friars who played a major role in negotiating the ransom and documenting the rescue. The Trinitarians presided over the negotiations after the Spanish surrender of La Mamora on April 30th, 1681. Reading the sources which they themselves produced, it becomes evident that the friars, according to their own accounts, chose to prioritize the redemption, the freedom of objects over that of humans. Their first step in the negotiations with the Sultan was to agree to exchange 7 images for 7 Muslim slaves. And this shows that these devotional artifacts afforded Muslim rulers an opportunity to care for their enslaved subjects and project their religious and political power. But this exchange also implies what we might call a value hierarchy. For Trinitarian friars who carried the rescue negotiations, devotional objects were more valuable than human captives and commensurable with enslaved Muslims. The negotiations of the captive and objects captured in La Rache in 1689 reveals a different value hierarchy. The first part of the negotiation concerned the release of 100 Spanish officers. On July 7, 1690, the king pleaded with the Sultan, and I'm quoting, "We hope that you will send us the officers freely, as well as the friars, their servants, and the images, silver, and the rest belonging to the friars." The list is instructive both in terms of the items it includes and excludes, as well as in terms of the internal organization of the items in it. On the one hand, the king and his agents lump together humans and objects in the same category, establishing a matrix of similarity and continuity between them. On the other hand, by arranging these items in a certain order, they set out a clear hierarchy according to which Some objects, devotional, are more valuable than other objects, liturgical. Humans are more valuable than objects, and some humans, such as military officers, are more valuable than other humans, such as friars and their servants. As is clear, the importance of redeeming religious objects along with human captives was widely acknowledged by the king, by the friars, and by state bureaucrats. However, it was only the Trinitarians who implied that the redemption of image was more urgent than that of humans. For Catholics, the problem was not that objects changed hands, but rather that they changed hands with Muslims, considered Spain's archenemies. After all, Christian images would very likely have already changed hands before they fell prey to Muslim appropriation. In fact, Catholics exchanged all sorts of religious objects in a wide range of transactions. Religious images circulated among manufacturers, dealers, church organizations, and the faithful. Both expensive and low-value objects were bartered or even pawned and later redeemed. Relics were targeted in holy thefts. The difference is that in all of these different forms of transactions, the parties involved shared attitudes towards the thing that passed hands. In exchange among members of the Christian community, none of the parties believed it was deeply wrong for the other to possess the object. And it was this difference that made the redemption of Christian religious objects from Muslims a matter of paramount urgency. Muslims and Christians' conflicting ideas about religious objects also meant that these artifacts offered each group unique opportunities. For Catholics, these sacred artifacts were a definitive feature of their identity and community, which thus had to be redeemed at all costs, regarding of the price tag the selling party attached to it, or the object's material value. The Sultan also treated devotional objects in terms of their affordances or the opportunity that they allowed him, though very different ones. This is why the Sultan preferred to exchange liturgical objects in their initial state rather than, for example, melting and recasting them or repurposing the gold color of the painting, their frames, or the sculptures. These devotional objects permitted Maghrebi rulers to symbolically assert Islam's power over Christianity. As I mentioned, Algerian pashas and perhaps Moroccan rulers too did on occasion threaten to break into the churches of the captives and burn the images they might find, unless Spaniards ceased to baptize Muslim slaves by force and agreed to punish those who desecrated their cadavers. In this regard, Christian devotional objects afforded Maghrebi rulers a means to efficiently assist their subjects enslaved across the sea, and in this way claim spiritual guardianship and political sovereignty over these subjects. Thus, even if money changed hands when Catholic redeemed devotional objects, these transactions were always more than mere commodification for both parties. Friars and captives conceived of their purchase of looted religious objects as redemption, and consequently played down these artifacts' monetary value. Muslims, of course, didn't share this view, but they acknowledged the status of those objects as what we might call inalienable possessions for Christians. Indeed, their skillful management of such exchanges was based on this acknowledgement. They too didn't reduce the value of the objects they sold to their metallic value and exchanged them for social, political, and religious purposes rather than economic ones, or at least not solely for economic purposes. So far, I was talking about a group of very different objects that were sent to North Africa to help captives, that were captured on the way, that were redeemed, and that returned to Spain. And I sort of like treated them as a category, despite their very different form, matter, function, suggesting that we can talk about captive objects because it's a category that was created by their movement in similar paths, by the fact that they elicited similar responses and expectations, and intensified interactions and links between enemy confessional communities. I want to conclude by saying something about what happened to such images after their return home. King ambassadors and friars who redeemed objects could enhance their own authority by controlling these objects' meanings and using them to boost their prestige. The renown that such objects acquired was attractive to those who rescued them, as well as to the patron who subsequently came to own them and the communities in which they resided. The process by which this prestige was created and enhanced was reciprocal. For example, ecclesiastic entrepreneurs carefully shaped objects' histories by composing and circulating pamphlets and broadsheets, etching prints of redeemed objects, commissioning painters to depict the suffering and redemption of devotional images, and establishing confraternities dedicated to particular objects. And let me give you one example of this. So I mentioned the Christ of Medina Celi that became the most important devotional object in Madrid these days. Here it is again. And this is a painting from the beginning of the 18th century that describes the supposed throwing of the statue to the lion den, negotiating its capture. Here is the image. Here are two Trinitarian friars that were responsible for redeeming it. And this is the Plaza Mayor in Madrid, in front of the Royal Palace, and the procession, the victorious procession of arriving back in the city with the redeemed image. And this is another one of the same legend, of the same object. This is from the end of the 18th century from Peru. And again, you can see Moroccan soldiers damaging the statue. The statue is being lowered to the lion's den. The Trinitarians are negotiating the exchange of the statue, but the greedy Muslims wants them to add more coins to the pile. And eventually, the procession again in the Plaza Mayor in front of the palace. Not the palace, but this is where the king is watching the event. Devotional objects repaid these impresarios by sharing with them the prestige that the latter had helped shape. When this exchange was productive, the prestigious objects could become a gift to a powerful patron, further enhancing the reputation of object, giver, and receiver. The redeemed objects from La Mamora were distributed among members of the royal family and the higher nobility, and copies of the statue of this Christ of Medina Celi were sent to Trinitarian convents in Spain and abroad. Cardinal Portocarrero, the Franciscan Cardinal Portocarrero, first offered the redeemed objects of Larache to the king before gifting them to the Hospital of the Franciscan Order in Madrid, where they remain today. The friars played a host of roles in the remarkable transformation of the once captive objects with which they were associated. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We already have some questions in the chat box, so I'm going to go ahead and start to share some of those. So there was a lot of interest in the rosary beads and the Islamic prayer beads. So one question is if you could talk about where these things were produced. Is there any connection in terms of the location of their production?
Absolutely not, to the best of my knowledge. Or rather, the majority of the rosaries in North Africa were produced in Europe and sent to North Africa, even though we've seen that some captives prepared their own. I'm guessing that the majority of the misbahas were produced in North Africa or in Western Africa and sent up to North Africa with slaves and gold. They could have been produced in the Ottoman world and traveled to Ottoman Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers, and from there to Morocco. So they were produced in different places.
Thank you. And just a reminder to everyone else that you can still add questions you may have. So the next question is also about the rosary and the misbahas. Can you talk about the significance of the number of beads that are found on each?
In a very limited way, to be honest. We need a Catholic and a Muslim here in the crowd to help us with that. But basically, they are divided to equal number of beads, and they have a meditative power that the person holding them and like moving their fingers in a certain way that members of the same community would immediately identify as theirs. But someone who actually uses them could say much more about this than me, and I fear.
Well, I think that's fair enough. We have a
Yeah.
few more questions in the chat box, but we have someone who has raised their hand. It looks like Roush. I don't know if you would like to unmute to ask your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that answer. I'm a Muslim who use Mizbaha, and we have 33 on every one of them because we usually use it 3 times a day, and that adds up to like about 100. And we say these prayers like 100 times a day. So 33 each time, 3 times a day, and then it adds up to 100.
Thank you, Rush, and I think it's if I'm not mistaken, it's my student. So thank you very much for joining us and adding to the conversation.
Yes, thank you. So the slide you showed of the white misbahas, someone is curious if you happen to know what material was used.
Different stones, but again, unfortunately, I don't have. I'm not an expert to the material qualities. I'm really focusing on the exchange, on the circulation, and an art historian could say much more about it. I definitely should be able to answer this question, so it's something I'm going to find out for my own work. Thank you for this.
Thank you. And then also, was there an equivalent to the Islamic objects that were captured by the Christians and then ransomed?
Absolutely. And there is so in the case of Muslim objects, these are manuscripts. And the most famous theft of manuscripts happens in 1612 when a French consul cum pirate was commissioned to transfer the library of the Sultan of Morocco from one city to another. When he arrived at the port, he saw that the Sultan didn't rush to pay him. He pulled anchor and headed north with the idea of like reaching Spain and selling France and selling the collection there. On the way to France, he was captured by the Spanish fleet. And then negotiation over the restitution of the collection start. There are 3 rounds during the 17th century. In the 1610s, some of the offers that are on the table are exchanging the collection for the 2 cities that were conquered in the 1680s, right before the Spaniards conquered them in the 1610s. So before they conquered them, the Sultan or the Spaniards suggested that the Sultan would receive back his manuscripts in return for these port cities. Another offer was for a huge sum of money, and another offer was for the entire population of captives that was held at the time in Morocco. This failed, nothing came out of it. There is another round in the 1650s, and then another round in the 1690s. And in fact, there are also later cases. And so the library is still in Spain, in the El Escorial. And for this reason, Spain has the largest collection, or one of the largest collection of Islamic manuscripts in Europe, and perhaps in Europe, definitely in Europe. From another angle, this phenomenon of capturing Islamic manuscript was pretty common, to the degree that we have a number of fatwas, of legal opinions on the topic, telling believers what to do in such a case. Should it be ransomed? How it should be ransomed? Which manuscript should be ransomed first and which later? So yes, there is a parallel in the Islamic side. Thanks.
Thanks. And I think this will probably be our final question. And this one comes from Dr. Wendy Sepinen, who is the Meadows Museum's former Mellon Curatorial Fellow. And her work focuses on sculpture and metallurgy in the Hispanic world. And she writes that the quote you shared about the hospital church has really opened up a lot of questions for her. And she's wondering where the Catholic sculptures in Islamic territory came from. And is there any sense of how the relics were displayed? For example, reliquaries.
So the objects came either through plunder, or they were sent to these cities, or they were found in the churches of Spanish colonies conquered by Algerians or by Moroccans. I know nothing about the display of relics, but I can say that, I mean, this is a time period in which relics become, you know, like the rulers in Europe has huge collections of relics, including thousands of relics that are very popular. The most common ones, the ones we know mostly about, are relics of medieval saints, but some ecclesiastics, and not only ecclesiastics, who die in North Africa as martyrs. So I think I showed that objects can become captive. Objects are exchanged for captives. Captives can ransom objects, but captives can also become objects. And this happens when some captives died as martyrs and their remnants were venerated as relics. And this happened. And in a few cases, there was a lot of, it was very challenging to find, to be able to transfer the relics to Europe of people that died in North Africa. So I'm not sure that I'm answering the question, but then definitely there is more to be said about relics in North Africa. I'm hoping to have a chapter about that in this book.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining, but thank you so much, Daniel Herschensen, for bringing this kind of new research to us at the Meadows Museum. There's many glowing comments about the talk you just gave, and we appreciate you joining us over Zoom. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Take care.